And I don't like the divide of people who look at the contemporary Christian, and just sort of the same way people will say, I love all music except country. What are you talking about? It's such a broad genre to say I hate country when there's so much history behind it. I feel the same way about contemporary Christian music, because that pop, that wannabe, that radio play, yeah, I get it. That's not what should be in church. But there are shining moments like gospel music, like, even you had mentioned there are select ones in the contemporary Christian world where it's like, yeah, that could be something we use in the service.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromous. This is Byrne Power coming to you from halfway up my bookshelves here in Tbilisi, Georgia, on a fine day. Beautiful weather, can't complain. And today what we're going to do is have yet one more Anadromous dialogue, and this time we're going to meet ThatLauraPerson. She's quite a fascinating person to talk to, younger, Gen Z, I believe. But she was really fascinated with some of the things she has occasionally heard me say about Christian music. So the bulk of our conversation today will be on the issues and problems related to Christian music. And I'll let the conversation just pull itself out. So I've got two documentaries here. This one's called First Love, and it's interviews with some of the early Jesus people who made Jesus music. And this one's called The Jesus Music, and it is more of a documentary that takes a longer view, starting with the late 60s and 70s, going into the 21st century. Neither of these is very good. Because neither of them really has a critical bone in their body, and neither of them seem to really understand the issues that are presenting themselves. So, we're going to talk with Laura and see what kind of things we come up with as far as the nature of Christian music in the 21st century. Let's go.
So, ThatLauraPerson, is that how you...
You can call me Laura. Totally cool.
Identify?
So, what's funny about a moniker, right? Like, growing up as a kid with the internet, I made my first email at 13 because you're allowed to, choose your online identity. And it's so funny with the gender stuff. At that time, I didn't want to be specifically identified as boy or girl. So I made the name ThatLauraPerson.
I had the feeling there was some of that in there.
That's absolutely where it came from. But this is, years ago. This is like a decade ago when I made that name, before this really all came into the limelight. So it's interesting. And I've kept the name because, you market yourself online and all this stuff, but I don't know. I've kept it, but you can just refer to me as Laura. That is perfectly fine.
No, I was going to. And without necessarily giving away your last name, I do notice it's Finnish.
That is correct.
And that is what state do you live in?
I live in Wisconsin, but my whole family.
I figured it was either
Michigan.
Wisconsin or Minnesota, and both of those have a fair amount of Finns. So,
yes. Yep.
So have you been to Finland?
Sadly, I have not. My parents went on a trip, and I didn't get to join. So they met some of our family over there that we still have, some cousins and stuff. But it's interesting. My mom's side of the family is all Irish, so I've been to Ireland, but I haven't been to my dad's side of the family, which is all Finland. Right.
Yeah, I'm part Polish, part Ukrainian, which I've never been to, and probably a while before I get there.
Yeah.
And part Scottish and Norwegian, typical American mutt. And But I did get to Poland, and it was really an eye opener for me to go there, because my mother always identifies herself as Polish, and it was me who figured out that her mother was actually Ukrainian. She didn't even know that, because her mother didn't speak English that well and died when she was 15. So then I got to Poland, and then I started walking around. Her father was totally Polish, and I started walking around Poland saying, oh, I thought these were my mother, these traits, but they're not. They're Polish traits, and a certain kind of paranoia, a certain kind of like weird, Polish joke is you put your leg on something like you're going to tie your shoe, and then you tie the other shoe. And I realized that what that related to was the Polish desire to reinvent the wheel always. So they have there's like if you have locks in a river to get you up to one place or another, everybody in the world does it like this. You have a container of water, you fill it up, it raises, and then you go to the next level and you go. The Polish people, and I love this, there's a part of me that just says this is exactly what it means to be Polish. You run the boat up onto like a container. It's pulled up railroad tracks out of the water and then set in, and I just set in the next level, and I'm sitting there saying, that's brilliant. It's just like totally reinventing the wheel,
Yeah.
So anyway, I do suggest someday going to Suomi.
Oh yeah, I'd love to.
That's Finland, for those who don't know, and check out what you thought was just your father and turns out to be your culture. So since nobody knows you here on my channel, you're just this that Laura person.
Yeah.
If anyone who really looks at the other names on the comment section and whatnot. So I was going to ask you a little bit about, introduce yourself, talk about you. The main reason you got in touch with me was because of Christian music. So we'll get to that as that'll be our main course. But as an hors d'oeuvre, maybe you could explain, just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. I'm a child who grew up with the internet and has been observing this sort of culture that has emerged through social media. I've even been on the YouTube platform since 2011. So I made my channel in 2011, and I had made videos on YouTube as a child, as a middle schooler, and a couple of them blew up pretty big. And then I privatized all of them, because who wants to look back at, what they did in middle school? But I've always sort of had this relationship, I guess, with YouTube and the internet and how you present yourself. And then I've also had the relation with, Christian music. And so I reached out to you because you cover such a myriad of topics that I'm interested in. And you're sort of in the same circles of cultural thought as like the Peugeot figures or like Jordan Peterson, people like that, who have really blown up online. And I think it's because everybody's searching in one way or another. And I ultimately believe the searching is like a searching for God is what it comes down to. Everyone's searching for Christ in a way. But I don't know. I grew up in Michigan, but now I'm living in Wisconsin, and I started a podcast with some of my friends. That's what I've got going on right now on the internet. But outside of this, I play in a band, and I sing at my church, and I work in sound. So those are my
I can tell that you've been on the internet for a while because you're very articulate. I sometimes talk to people and I can tell that doing this whole thing with talking through a camera and everything is very abstract for them. And I totally understand that. I'm fortunate that I worked in radio for about 10 years in Alaska, and even a little bit of time before that in New York City. So to me, it's kind of like, okay, it's an extension of that, really, this kind of. But were you homeschooled or did you go to regular school?
I went to parochial school, and then I went to a Lutheran high school.
Okay.
And then I went to film school for college. And then I
Okay.
graduated in 2020. So
Okay.
that's a fun year to really kick things off, being in being in art school and graduating during the fun year.
Yeah, the fun year,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
The fun year. So,
Yeah.
the year when we all had so much fun.
Yeah. And during that time, I should say, so I went to school in downtown Chicago.
Mhm.
So I was living there from 2016 until 2020 when I decided to leave at one point in the spring. And I don't know, just such an interesting perspective. And now I've moved out to Wisconsin and I'm kind of in a country area. So it's
Mhm.
like I lived the extremes. I was living like downtown in Chicago and I'm kind of in a very
Right.
rural area.
I
So
understand that. To me, that made a lot of sense in my life. I was living in New York City for 16 years, then decided to move to Haines, Alaska, which has 2,500 people in the whole valley, and the
oh my
valley goes
gosh.
for like 40 miles. So,
Yeah.
but I loved it because to me, the one place I didn't want to be was in the suburbs. You
Yeah.
know, it was just like I didn't want to be in that in-between zone because I'd lived in the suburbs in California growing up, and it's just like, no, I don't want to have to walk or drive to get a loaf of bread.
Yeah.
I'd rather live in a small town where I could get to people in New York City. When they heard I was moving to Alaska, they were like, Byrne, what are you doing? Don't you want to be around anyone? And actually it was just the opposite, because in a smaller situation, you have to get to know many more people. In my situation in Alaska, I probably easily knew half the town. That is
Yeah.
say, hi, how you doing kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And had different rings of people of different degrees of closeness. But, I could walk into the post office after being gone for 3 months in Europe looking for puppets, walk in and they go like, how did your trip go, Byrne? Which to me is like, I love that. Now I'm living in another big city again in Tbilisi,
Yeah.
Georgia. The nice thing about this is it's like everybody just goes, huh? And is that between like Macon and Atlanta? It's just,
Yeah.
because it just doesn't register, especially to Americans.
I don't know if you want to take the time to answer this, but I'm just wondering, what made you move to Georgia? Like, what called you there?
I thought it was near Atlanta. No. No, it was, what can I say? My life in Alaska was very good, but they say when eagles want their young to leave the nest, they've feathered it and put leaves and all sorts of things down, hunks of weeds and stuff. Sometimes we have actual like elderberry bushes growing out of the tops of eagles' nests in Alaska that are like, 70 feet off the ground in a spruce tree. But they say that when the eagles really want the younger birds to kind of get ready to go, they'll start pulling the nice parts of the nest out and just leave the pieces of woods. And that's what I started to feel in Alaska. Is I just felt like, I love it here. And Haines, Alaska, I'm still like a huge promoter of, so like when people say I'm going to Alaska, I say, well, forget about all that other stuff. Just go to Haines because everything's right there except for, Mount McKinley, Denali. And you don't want to really go to Fairbanks. It's too weird. And Anchorage we call it Los Anchorage. So yeah, just go to Haines and you get everything you want. You want glaciers there, bears there, whales are there, moose, 5 species of salmon, largest gathering of bald eagles in the world. What else could you want? It's mountains, rivers, fjord. So I would just tell people, go there. But like I said, for me, it was just like the nest was being denuded of the things that left me comfortable, to the point where finally they came up to me. I had been renting very cheaply this really lovely, weird house for a long time. That wasn't that nice, but it was very comfortable for me. And they sold it out from under me, eventually leveled the thing. And that was what gave me the final impetus to go, okay, I have to really rethink things. And I had discovered Georgian music and dance through YouTube videos. I'd actually originally found Georgian music many years ago in the 1980s. I have one record, which turns out to really be Georgian music, which is a specific area of Georgian music here. But and I always thought that was a great record, but I never really looked into it much more because it was in the Soviet Union, and you know, you're never going to visit there. And okay, they've got weird people in the mountains doing stuff that sounds great, but you know, do I really want to go there? No. I have a great album of from Gabon of pygmies yodeling, which is wonderful, but did I ever want to go there? No. So it's like one of those things where I just thought, okay. But then suddenly my brain shifted, and I was asking a musical question, and the musical question was this. One thing I know very well in my musical research, and I have hundreds of records and CDs from the Middle East, and one thing I knew very well is that most Arabic music is just one, it's, what's the word I'm looking for? Polyphonic, monophonic. In the sense that it's just one tune. There's no harmonies. It's just one tune. And so, for instance, if you have an orchestra of 70 people backing a singer like the great Kulthum, you'll hear them. You'll hear like you know, 50 violins playing, no harmony whatsoever, which creates this weird effect because they can't all shift at the same time to the next note. So you get this weird, sounds like this weird kind of effect that you get only with that kind of music. But meanwhile, the rhythms are really complicated, but the actual musical language was very simple as far as singing. And then I realized, okay, well then there's Jewish music, which is also from the Middle East originally, and the old Jewish cantorial music really sounds Middle Eastern. And I have quite a few records of that, and I'm very familiar with it. And I said, and then there's also klezmer music, which is more European influence. But I thought to myself, well, the interesting thing about Jewish music is how sad it can sound, which is much different than the other Middle Eastern music. I was in a little village here that was an Azerbaijani village here in Georgia near the border, and we were doing I was with some friends who were doing a puppet show. And, you know, there was the mosque, the call at the mosque in the middle of the day, and I'm listening to it. Now, here's the funny thing about that. I'm listening to it, and they are, you know, there's a kind of a dry, bittersweet quality to the mosque chants, which are always in Arabic. But then I'm standing near these Georgians. When they hear it, this one guy immediately looks for the harmonic notes for it, because that's the Georgians. Well, anyway, I thought about the Jewish music, which is also really good for humor, oddly enough. And so much of, for instance, so much of our cartoon music from the middle of the 20th century is based on Jewish music. So the music you would hear in Bugs Bunny or that sort of thing would be, I mean, I could identify the Jewish elements in it. A person who also had a lot of that in their soundtrack music was Danny Elfman. His early scores, particularly like for Tim Burton, a lot of that stuff is very much has a Jewish klezmer undertone to it, and which is very funny music, can also be very sad music too. So, but then I said, okay, so if there's Christian music in the Middle East, because one thing I realized about music is that music reflects essentially the highest principles of a culture, which does raise a lot of questions about ours. But, but I thought to myself, so if there was a Christian group in the same area, and since, you know, there's of course Greece and such, but I thought to myself, but I knew the music of Greece, and it wasn't what I was thinking. I was thinking one of the elements of Christian music is that it has harmony, almost always, and then it has resolution.
Yeah.
So, because unlike the Jewish music, where there is no real resolution in philosophically,
Mm-hmm.
and in the Middle East, you just have this one. God is seen as one.
That you're making connections here that
Yeah.
are so unique. I've never even thought about it in this way.
Yeah,
Wow.
well, I realize there have to be because of the Trinity, there has
Yeah.
to be that sense of harmony and
Wow.
resolution because of the resurrection. So I
Yeah.
thought to myself, okay, I mean, in a way, Jewish music is like Christianity if there was no resurrection.
Hmm.
But in the resurrection, so wherever you go and hear Christian music, there's some absolutely amazing Tahitian gospel music, and they have amazing harmonies and amazing resolution. But it's the same with Black gospel music in America. It's the same with African gospel music of different stripes, or even the Catholic music of the Congo that was done. But it's true in the different Orthodox countries. And of course, it's very true in the West in various church traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I suddenly said, oh, wait a minute. There's that Georgia place. And I said, okay, let me look for that. And I looked, and suddenly it was just like, it's like, where do you buy albums by these people? And I'm still very much, if you look over here, I'm always confused by this. If you look behind me over there, you'll see part of that shelf has a bunch of CDs on it, because I still collect. I actually have albums that I find on the street here and such, and I have a little portable record player. While I'm waiting to bring my actual library here, people see that and say, oh, you have such a nice library. And they think I'm joking when I say that's not my library. That's just what I have here, because I have the real thing in Alaska that I'm still trying to get here. And but as soon as I found that, I said, oh my goodness, this has to be the most incredible music, because it has harmonies, and sometimes they're very dissonant harmonies, certainly by Western standards, but they always resolve in the most beautiful ways. And in fact, I believe, it was Igor Stravinsky who was asked near the end of his life, the great composer. Someone said, so what kind of music do you listen to these days? And he listed a class, the name of a couple composers, but he said, mostly just Georgian music, and mostly that from Guria. And if you hear the Gurian music and then hear his music, you're like, oh, I see, because this music is so complex. Now, I was telling this to a Georgian the other day, this younger Georgian girl, and she said, no, it's not that complicated. I said, you have no idea. You're like a fish in water, and we're trying to explain to you what dry is, and you just don't get it. It gives Georgians, when they decide they really like music, it gives them this sense of like they can appreciate anything because it's all simple. Not that they do, because they are being infected by the same musical drugs as everyone else globally. But anyway, so how did we get over here? Oh yeah, you asked a question. So
yeah, I mean, that was a great connection of how the music reflects the belief, and the music reflects the culture. Something I'd never even thought about.
And Georgia is an Orthodox Christian country, and they were the second country in the world to be converted.
Yeah.
Armenia is the first, Georgia is the second, although sometimes the Georgians will say, well, really, the gospel was brought here before. They'll argue with themselves, like siblings.
Yes. So. Yeah, that's a ton of history. That's interesting, because I've always had this idea, and you probably have a bunch of thoughts on this, that being an American, I've always thought like America has sort of this Protestant soul. Like those old countries have a very traditional soul, and so the people and their belief reflect it. But then you look at America, and it's like you have these extremes of really, Quaker roots, I guess, and the running away from, the Church of England and stuff. And some of the music reflects that. And when you brought up in the email that you wrote, talking about those different shape note singing, which I was familiar with
Mhm.
before you really went into it all. And like just the difference in culture between, you know, somewhere that's had this belief for a long time versus, I guess, sort of a relatively newer generation that's carrying it and sort of making it their own. And you see that sort of same thing with the gospel music of people who came from, you know, Africa to the United States, carried their tunes with them, and then through conversion to Christianity, you know, came up with texts like "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," the birth of gospel music and stuff like that.
Mhm. You'll be very happy to know that I'm now preparing. I mentioned gospel music in one of my videos, and people are immediately said, "Byrne, when are you doing your gospel thing?" So I've decided I'm doing two. One is a history of gospel music, and another is just maybe picking out 10 great songs
That's great.
and playing them in total. And, you know, I don't really care about making money on the videos, although I need the money, but I just know that there are various reasons why I can't. And one is in order to make money, I have to go to the mailbox and get a letter sent by AdSense from Google, take it to the bank. And I'm sitting here in a country where there are no mailboxes.
That sounds like a fun mystery to solve.
And my bank isn't here.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those things. Someday I may figure it out. But then I'm often watching videos. I have an ad block on my computer, but if I watch something on the television screen, I'll see the kind of advertisements and the way they interrupt things. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want to do that to people. So it's, yeah. So tell me your involvement with Christian music and
Sure.
and let us know
Yeah.
what kind of questions and things have you had? But you know, because I could obviously just dump, you know,
Sure.
just a whole load of stuff here, but
yeah, I would love to get into the commentary sort of on contemporary Christian music, but I'll give a little bit of background for myself for people who obviously have no idea who I am. I grew up singing in church all the time, Lutheran background, but a traditional Lutheran background.
Are you still attending Lutheran services, or are you now in a more
I am still attending Lutheran services. I'm
Okay.
still a member of the LCMS.
So you're still singing "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," in other words.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's like one of the number one greatest all-time hits, certainly for the Lutherans. But
I mean, it's coming up, that Reformation Sunday, but anyway, it's always on All Saints Day or near All Saints Day. But yeah, so I grew up singing traditional sort of Lutheran songs and even borrowing from some Catholic music. You know, our church, we had a very ambitious director growing up who loved classical music and loved the history of you know, church and choral music. So we sang really old stuff. You know, in high school, we sang Bogorodice with our choir, which was super cool and introduced me into like a whole other world of choral music. So I was doing that basically throughout high school, and then I went to college, on the south side of Chicago, and I was in a gospel choir there, and it was like 360, completely flipped, very traditional background. We'd go to choir practice for gospel music, no paper, nothing.
Was this a mass choir or smaller?
This was a college choir. That was it originally started as a class, but it was a 1 credit hour class, and people would come to the choir who were not taking the class, you know, just to be in the choir, to help out, sort of thing. And we would sing at events at the school, which is so interesting that they allowed that, you know, because these songs are so, you know, I can go to the rock if everything else fails. It's all about Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And we're singing this at the most, you know, imagine liberal arts college on steroids. Yeah. Like it's insane because, you know, the people who are probably listening to the music and cheering us on, no faith, nothing, no connection at all to that background. But The cool thing about the choir is a ton of the members who were in that group were also attending, Baptist church or Kojic church on south side of the city. So they were all people who were born and bred in that type of environment. So me as a newcomer, you just kind of have to pick up where everybody's already at, because they already know all these exercises. Sure, I may know solfege from my time in a fancier like choral choir, but now we're doing these numbers, and we're going past 7. So it was interesting to jump into that world, but it made me see that on both sides of the coin, both in a traditional setting and in a contemporary setting, you can really have a powerful moment where you're all praising God, and I don't like the divide of people who look at the contemporary Christian, and just sort of the same way people will say, I love all music except country. What are you talking about? It's such a broad genre to say I hate country when there's so much history behind it. I feel the same way about contemporary Christian music, because that pop, that wannabe, that radio play, yeah, I get it. That's not what should be in church. But there are shining moments like gospel music, like, even you had mentioned there are select ones in the contemporary Christian world where it's like, yeah, that could be something we use in the service. But it's a thin line, and the problem that you run into that I'm dealing with where I live now is you live in a small town. You don't have the talent that you could get in a big city choir. So what pieces do you choose for that sort of environment? So
yeah.
And
I feel like you were just starting. Keep going.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. Well, and I'm very particular is kind of where this goes. And so, I believe that as the younger generation of the church, we are being called to fill the shoes and to step into place and, lead as the older generation sort of passes away. And that's what I'm attempting to do in my church environment right now. And I have a couple of young friends who are, around my age, who are on the same mission, but the open question that we're all, talking about all the time is, how do we get more people involved? Is really the big thing. And I think music is a, kind of like that. Is it Stevie Wonder song? Music is a language we all understand, or whatever. Sir Duke.
Right.
Music, we can all hear this and we can all understand what it is across borders. So
my feeling is that the church took I could get into my whole history of Christian music thing. And often there have been, I think the real problem came in about the 1870s. That's my typical, Byrne, where's the problem starting? And people say, well, it's started a long time ago in the 1960s. I'm kind of, what are you talking about? It's like 1960s, long time ago. I was alive, so it's not that long. But
I'm getting more and more why you moved to Georgia.
Oh yeah. No, I love I'm actually this afternoon, I have another conference call that I'm going to record with a guy named Teddy from Israel, who's quite an interesting guy. Then I'm being taken to a guy who's a winemaker, but he just had a show of the puppets he designed. And they're just like some of the most beautiful puppets I've ever seen. And so I'm kind of doing a little bit of a couple of videos on him. And so I'm going to go out to his winery / record, and not record store in my dreams. There aren't any here, really. To his restaurant. I guess he's got kind of a wine tasting place or a restaurant. And so I'm going to go out there and with some people. I always have to watch myself when I'm around Georgians because they really like to drink wine. Fortunately, Georgian wine isn't super heavy in alcohol. But at the same time, I have to, just really pace myself. Fortunately, they tend to space out their, like, if they have this thing called a supra, it tends to go over like about 4 or 5 hours.
Okay.
But they have this whole toasting culture that there's a great story they tell, because basically they see themselves as, their whole culture revolves around what they call the vine, the grape. And they are the first people we know about in history to have fermented grapes. And it goes back 8,000 years. So they tell this story that in the beginning of time, when God was handing out countries and land to all the peoples of the world, he handed out each little piece to these people and now those people. And then the Georgians came in late, as they always do, because they're always late. I mean, if a Georgian arrives within an hour of the time they say they're going to, I consider that on time here. And I was recently in Germany, where everyone comes on time, and so but they arrived late, and they said, okay, we're here, what were you going to give us? And God turns to them and says, sorry, we already gave everything away and there's nothing left. And they said, but we were having a special meal, and we were drinking wine, and we were toasting in your name. And God said, really? And they go, yeah. And they said, okay, I'll give you the bit of land I was saving for myself. So,
what a great story.
Yeah. But that probably encapsulates what Georgia really is. This weird sort of place where, and the attitude of the people is kind of like that as well. You get the lateness, kind of like they're kind of laid back on so many things. And at the same time, very earnest, and even the atheists here have a bit of respect for the church. I mean, not all of them, especially the younger ones these days are getting smartphoneized, and but still, it's here, and it's a very interesting place. But where was I going? 1870s.
Yes.
What's interesting about the 1870s is it's the period right after the American Civil War. And people were looking for something. The nation had torn itself to pieces. And people, we often think like, that was really rough after September 11th. Yeah, I don't know if you're old enough to have too many emotions connected to that. But
yeah.
I mean, and I remember after President Kennedy was assassinated, I was young, but I remember that as a very important thing, and which in a weird way, we still haven't gotten over it. And, but, imagine the entire country's ripped itself in two, and we've lost more Americans in that war than any other war in history. So, and that includes World War II and World War I and Vietnam War and everything else.
Yeah, and it's on our soil.
Yeah, exactly. So the decade or so after that, people are lost. Americans are wondering, who are we? And it's in that period that you start getting evangelistic preachers like Dwight Moody going through the country, having these large revival meetings. And when they go for music, there's a kind of division between before the war and after the war. And the songs after the war start to be called gospel song, not to be confused with black gospel music.
Sure.
And gospel song is a great illustration of it is the song In the Garden. It's just like,
oh,
he
my
walks
gosh,
with me and he talks with me.
Love that song.
Well, I always have problems with that song because what I hear is the sentimentality of it.
Oh.
And he tells me I am his own, and the love we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. And for me, sentimentality is when I've had people react to me and say, well, sentimentality is the best thing we have, with singing. And what they mean is emotion. And I'm going like, yeah, really honest emotion in music is great. That's one reason I love classic gospel music, is because it's right there, and you feel the darkness and you feel the joy, and it's right there. But sentimentality is when the emotion is not appropriate for the object of the emotion. So the idea of, you see, one of the things that happened was that pietism came in from Europe, and it came in America in the kind of the 19th century. And pietism kind of eventually, and the difference between pietism and other forms of Reformation theology is pietism stresses me and Jesus alone, whereas the other churches prior to that stressed the congregation.
Sure.
And of course in Catholicism or Orthodox, you really express the church in a larger sense.
Yeah.
And so in pietism, you have this idea that it's me and Jesus, and that's the most important relationship. And of course, that is important. But the problem is when it becomes important, and all ideas, when they're pushed to a further extreme, start to develop problems. So in pietism, you have this sense of it's just me and Jesus. And that kind of came in through Methodism, but it also came in through the revival meetings of the what we call the Second Awakening in America. So there's the First Awakening is in the second part of the 18th century. The Second Great Awakening happened about a decade or so before the Civil War. So it was during the 1870s that pietism essentially came into the church through these, in a very much more serious way, through these revival meetings. And what they did was they purposely played on the emotion. So you needed music to invite people to come. So when I was younger, I went to a Billy Graham meeting, and he would always have like someone like George Beverly Shea doing his music. And it would always be this kind of invitational, emotional music that kind of hit these heartstrings. Now, I'm convinced in the 1870s when this music started in, and who was it? Moody and Iris Sankey. Billy Sunday had Homer Rodeheaver, and Billy Graham had George Beverly Shea. And these kind of classic preachers would always have someone to do the music. Now, interestingly, if you look at the music they're actually doing, and I don't know if you've seen my video on minstrel music, which I would highly recommend. It's called The Most Taboo Music in American History, because no one wants to see those people with blackface singing.
Yeah.
But I just dive all the way off the deep end on that one. And because to me, you wouldn't have country music. There's about 5 or 6, maybe 7 major areas of American music which would not exist had Americans not tried to strangely imitate Black culture. Then again, it works the other way around, as I'll show in gospel music, where there is still African music there, but because of the nature of Protestantism versus Catholicism, the Protestants said basically, okay, you guys are human beings. You have to stop doing the stuff where you're worshiping idols and stuff. Whereas so it's just like no drums, no rituals, blah, blah, blah. Whereas the Catholics tended to look at them as young children. And so they said, well, you know what you're doing in the back half of the plantation? Give it some Christian names, we'll be happy. And I'm simplifying, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But I think that what happened was there was another thing that came in with that pietism, because they were very closely related. And that other thing was romanticism, philosophical. But it was a very commercialized version of romanticism. So in romanticism, you also have this emphasis on emotion, an emphasis on what in sensibilité, sense and sensibility. The idea that the sensibility was to be able to appreciate things. So in romanticism, it was originally about nature and the soul. And out of this, you got, the nature of a certain country and the mountains and things like this. But by the time it comes to America, through the church, it is now predominantly commercialized to be about emotional feeling between me and God. And so you can see where the pietism and the romanticism kind of blended in together there.
Sure.
And that became a problem for the church. Oh, by the way, I was mentioning, if you listen to the music anywhere between Dwight L. Moody and, that is, say, the 1870s and, say, the 1920s, it's all going, if you back up a moment, if you know anything about the music that was also popular at that time, it's going to sound like the carnival music and pop music of the age. And what I show in the minstrel lecture, it's really a lecture I gave at L'Abri, but I put visuals and stuff to it. What I showed in that is that it is the first pop music, because pop music, or commercial music we'll call it, it doesn't have certain other elements that, for instance, it doesn't have the elements that make up classical music. There's a certain kind of artistic construction. It doesn't have that, although it has its own form of construction. And it doesn't have the place in society the same way that, what is it? Well, you know, people used to work and sing at the same time.
Yeah.
To have sea shanties where people would be hoisting the anchor up and stuff and singing a song with that, or, you know, pulling on the, making sure the sails were working and everything. There was a song for every function. And there are actually very late recordings of Black prisoners singing on chain gangs in the South. Amazing recordings of this stuff. But there was a music for every point. But popular music isn't about that. It's about essentially selling the music. It's about the commercial.
It's all commercial.
Yeah. So,
it's the hit of the week.
Yeah.
In the 1930s, printed on little cardboard records or whatever.
Well, the thing is, to understand pop music, you have to understand it the way we understand McDonald's compared to what you cook at home.
Sure.
And that is to say, you can make a hamburger at home. It's not going to be like a McDonald's hamburger for many, many reasons. It's going to be your own personal funky hamburger with your own personal funky stuff on it. Whereas McDonald's has to make a repeatable commodity. And there's certain elements in it that they've discovered will work with everybody. And one of them is salt, another one is sugar, another one is fat. You know, so they have them in certain degrees, and they realize they can stimulate the taste, and they can make it pretty much the same everywhere, because that's what commercial music is. So it looks for the basic elements in cooking would be the basic elements of taste. Well, in music, it's the basic elements of communication, which number one would be you need a tune, and two, you need emotion. And so popular music has generally always been about emotion. And a lot of times, and you know, sometimes there'll be a great pop song that everyone likes. And if you look at the reason why, you'll sometimes say that's because there's actually honest emotion there. But if you look at also a number of other scenarios, it's also because, like McDonald's, they figured out a formula to give you the basic illusion of, just as McDonald's gives you the illusion of really good nutrition, they give you the illusion of great music. So it hits emotional. You know, why was Britney Spears so popular? Because she hits the illusion of emotion, although in her case, much of that emotion, and by that time in our history, the emotion is about, it's about, the sentimentality now is now about sex, whereas that would never be the case 100 years earlier.
Yeah.
So there would be, the sentimentality then would be about romance, which is very different than what Britney Spears is singing about. So if you listen to the Christian music, you hear this kind of carnivalesque sound, this sort of, you know, the tunes and stuff. I don't know if you know the song, "In My Heart There Rings a Melody" or something like that. And it's like da 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 da. Da, 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 da. You may not have heard that. We sang that in a Presbyterian church with some regularity. And I listened to that, and I'm simply saying to myself, I'm in a carnival fairground, 1922. And this is,
Yeah.
in a sense, it's more about that good time feeling. It's just like the reason why In the Garden is a troubling song for me is because it hits the emotional tug. I actually believe in bad music. That is to say, I believe there is a thing. Some people will say, well, as long as it's music. And I go like, yeah, I get that.
Yeah,
I have another tune to sing, this would work. But the truth is, and I've heard music redeemed by, say, street performers that I had previously thought were pretty bad because they don't use the same chord progressions. They don't use the same notes. They straighten it out in a different sort of way. Because what happens is, to get the emotional resonance, and Leonard Bernstein explains this very well when he talks about the progression in history to use more and more notes. And he says with our chords and such, and he talks about at a certain point what he calls musical mush, and he plays this song which has all of these extra notes and such to get you to feel these things. Mm-hmm. And I just sat there and said, yeah, that's what happened. We got to the point where, why play a D chord when you can play a D7?
Yeah.
And I would notice this when I was younger. I played guitar, and I was always looking in these Christian little books about, that had the chords for some of the songs we wanted to sing. And I was going like,
sure,
that shouldn't be a D7. That should be a D. And a D7 makes it indeterminate as far as what the emotion is, where the D is solid. It's just like, and if you sang the same song on a D, it's like you've got solid music. But if you sang it on a D7, that chord right there, it just be like, suddenly it's like indeterminate, because I think that one of the keys of sentimentality in music is to use the, are you there?
I am. Yeah,
Sorry,
I'm still here.
Some weird thing happened. Oh, I know what happened. Is to have some sort of indeterminate quality of music. Like I noticed this with a lot of music after the midway point of the night, around the year 2000 it started, where the music started having more and more, like for instance, the music of the teens, the last decade.
Music.
Yeah. Well, to me, when I listen to it, and this is especially true in the Christian music, particularly the Hillsong stuff, is I hear these chords that basically they tug on the heart, but what are they tugging on it to do? Are they tugging on it to express joy? Not really. Are they tugging on it to express sorrow? Not really. So there's this one song, you may know it, I don't remember the name. All I remember is the chorus. Oh, I mean, it could be called I Believe, but it just goes over and over. I believe, I believe. And I'm sitting there going like, I don't believe you because of the chords you're using.
Yeah.
That is to say, the chords tell me you don't believe. The chords tell me you're hoping to believe. And that is to say, it's just like I'm trying to work up the emotion to believe, as if faith was emotion. And this is what I think happened to all Christian music in the 20th century. And there was a moment where the Jesus movement challenged that, and then fell straight back into it with new powerful means. We then created CCM and Christian contemporary music, although I tend to call it Christian commercial music because a lot of it is, although there are good things in there. And even, I was, anyway, I've been talking on and on. I am sure you have lots of thoughts.
I definitely want to go back to the thing that you said about, the whole rant sort of went off from the that song In the Garden, and how that's sentimental rather than, I guess, sincere, maybe would be the way to say it. But what's interesting about this argument that you're proposing is that a ton of that Black gospel music is very personal and very me and Jesus sort of lyrics, but I think is not sentimental in the way that it is performed. Stuff like Going Up Yonder, like, it's very personalized. A ton of those songs. I mean, the first one I thought of is Precious Lord, Take My Hand. That is extremely personal. Amazing Grace, who saved a wretch like me. Um, you know, and I think possibly it gets into the area of, is this testimony, or is this is this sort of I guess a fake testimony? And something I saw growing up, because I grew up with a lot of pop Christian music being extremely popular, is the question of, is this a love song about a person or a love song about God? And with those type of songs, I can definitely see, okay, this is not holding any weight. It's completely sentimental. There's, where's the depth, I guess, is the question. Um, and that idea of the difference between Protestant thought and sort of older Catholic Orthodox thought of the collective versus the personal, in a way. Another song that I thought of that I always grew up singing is like The Church is One Foundation, which really goes back to this is about us as a collective. There, that great line about those saints their watch are keeping, their cry goes up, how long? And soon the night of weeping shall be the morn of song. Like, that's sort of one where it bridges the gap between, this is the collective us. It's talking about a problem. It's talking about a personal human reality, but it's still pointing upward, which is the big thing to focus on. The In the Garden, though,
No, I understand. It's considered a classic, and
it's minstrel in the way it sounds, because I never even considered it until you just said that. And it's, and he walks with me, and he
exactly, and that is the heart tug right there. But it's in the music.
Yeah, and the way that the music reflects exactly what
that song
the
is a perfect illustration. And I think if you listen to my most taboo music in American history, I think, and it's like an hour and a half long, but I really get into it there. This is also the first commercial music, because you have people pretending to be Black and understanding the Black experience. And here's the interesting thing about that. Minstrel music doesn't start in the South. It starts in New York City. So it's not even people who are around Black people that much. It's people who've seen them from a distance and go like, oh, it must be interesting to be on a plantation. Yeah, it would be difficult, but you could sit there and eat watermelon. And so, for instance, there are different categories of songs. And one of them is, I would love to have, we've never seen this in a movie, to have been at one of the larger minstrel shows in the second half of the 19th century after the Civil War, where you have this procession of these super colorfully dressed people marching down the middle of an aisle in an auditorium, playing these tambourines and such, and singing the opening song. The opening song is always wild. It's just this crazy, intense song. It's like the original version of rock and roll or something, or country music, or bluegrass, but it's all, or jazz. It's all there. It's what's coming is all there. But then the next song is usually, there's also comedy, and the comedy usually takes the form of two guys talking to each other. And this one guy will say, and they're always doing these Black accents, and one guy will say something like, I heard your wife, I got to do this right. It's just like, let's see. So how's your wife? And he goes, she left me. And the other guy goes, did she leave you much? Like it's sort of like, how much money did she leave you, or something, or the house or whatever after a divorce or something like that. But it's this goofy humor that later becomes like Hee Haw, the television show where the two white guys are talking. So much of this becomes country music.
Yeah.
And one of the big differences between European music and American music is the influence of African American music. And I would say also the misinterpretation of African American music. So the second song was always this plantation song, they call it, and where you get this sentimental kind of slow sentimental song. Often you'd get these slow sentimental songs with harmony, and as soon as you hear the harmony, you immediately are saying to yourself, barbershop quartet. You're saying American musicals. You're saying the Beach Boys, because that's all it contained in there. But what's interesting about these harmonies, and some of them are quite fascinating, though, is that, and the plantation song in particular is a troubling thing. The plantation song is going to become the American crooner's pop song. But the plantation song is guys imagining what it's like to be a black field hand and singing. But what are they singing? You listen. Now, there's some African elements in the opening song, but when you get to this, there are very few. It's European music put through this weird thing, and when you listen to the harmonic structure, it's pure sentimentality. And this, as far as I can find, is the first instance of this kind of sentimentality that you don't find in music prior to that. Everything has a beginning. Now there's different kinds of music in the past that I'm sure led to some strange emotions, don't get me wrong. Sure. So, I mean, some sort of orgiastic music, or, there's all sorts of stuff. But there was never this weird sort of imitation sound before. And it's that imitation sound that sold quite well. And the thing you have to remember is minstrel music had a longer run of success than rock music or jazz. It lasted in a popular form over 100 years. And there were still minstrels, a few really small, pathetic minstrel troops running through the South in the 1960s, early 60s. Wow. So it starts in the 1840s, 1830s actually, and goes all the way through, and now it's become taboo to even point at the imagery. And, it's become, although I've discovered that, I mentioned this in my lecture, that I had some people over at my house in Alaska, and I was showing them video clips, because there are quite a few from the early part of the 20th century of people like Al Jolson and such, and playing music for a group of people. And in that group of people, there was one guy who was kind of an Armenian background, a couple who were both kind of white Northeastern Protestant, post-Protestant, we'll call them Americans, in other words, liberals. And then the last guy was a black guy. The white couple, the Armenian ancestor guy didn't have any particular feeling related to it. The white couple were extremely nervous about it, me just even playing the stuff. The black guy said, "This is fascinating.
Yeah.
This is no one ever talks about this stuff." And
I
that's
know
how
nothing about it. Yeah.
Oh, exactly. It's off the table. It's not for discussion, which is, of course, that was my reason for discussing it. But I'd been fascinated by it for years. But as soon as I realized people were going in this politically correct direction, I said, okay, let me punch a hole through this. Let's see if I can get through this. And I gave this lecture at L'Abri. So
I was going to say, I think there's elements where you definitely have to go back to that history. I hate the thing of erasing history or attempting to cover it up. How do you grow? How do you live? How do you learn? So,
well, after World War II, we have some of the most sentimental music in American history. The decade immediately after World War II, in the standard white popular realm, what you would have heard on radio stations, was some of the most commercial music. You have to wait until you get to, I hate to say this, the 20 teens to find music that commercial like that. Because it was just music to sell, and it was so trivial. And so, I mean, I could list songs. Probably the best one to hold up as an example here, I've got it dangling in front of you as a dying thing, is "How Much Is That Doggy in the Window?" That was a huge and there were so many songs like that. I have a record of just songs from that period. I'm sitting there going like, really? 3 little fishes swimming in an itty bitty pool? You know, it's just like, really? Hut Ralston on the Rilla-Raw? Really? All these weird songs that are just like, and this is why kids started switching the dial and discovering all this stuff going on in the Black world, which at that point in the early 1950s, they had just hit their stride. In fact, I argue in my gospel, when I get to the gospel video I'm eventually going to make, that the peak was in the 1950s and early 60s. And then
it's a strong take.
Huh?
It's a strong take.
Yeah.
Because there's so much gospel music.
Well, you see, what I hear is after a certain point, I hear the commercial elements coming in. You see, because I hear it in the notes. You know, and this is one thing where a lot of Christians will disagree. They'll say like, oh, the music can't be bad. And I said, really? Do you think you can do death metal and play it in church? And they will go, well, I go like, no. What you're saying is you do think there are sounds which are not appropriate. And when I was young, we used to argue whether Christians could do rock music at all. And the answer was always like, well, you know, and then eventually they just did as pop music. But then that music started to come into the church. But we never asked the following question: can Christians do commercial music? And that's what eventually won. Yeah. The sound. And I recognize that by saying this, I am essentially putting dynamite under most forms of Christian music since the 1970s. And saying, okay, bye. You know, because it's not that there's not good music. Every now and I'll hear something. Well, there was I'm trying to remember the name of this hymn it was early, like the aughts. And there was these people in Scotland, you probably know who they were, Scotland, Britain, trying to do these new hymns. And there was one I really liked. It was about Jesus. And I liked the way it mostly sounded. There was a few chord changes I wish they'd changed, but I said, okay, we're working at trying to make hymns again instead of praise songs, and which I have a great animosity for. Yes, I am. I'm working underneath the foundation. But then I bought the album that it originally appears on, and I just like, what are you doing? It's just like, get the producer out of the room, and it's the production. It's and a lot of people don't understand the effect of production. They just think I go in and then there's a guy who helps make it sound better, and I'm sitting there. No, if you can't hear this in a room without production, if they have to sweeten it, then you've got a problem.
Yeah, this is something interesting. I think this is the reason why I like older music more than current music. You're hitting the nail on the head, the overproduction, and also it doesn't sound professional without overproduction. It can't go to radio. It can't be published. It's interesting. Billie Eilish. I saw this clip of her. She's like huge in sort of like pop world.
I've got all her records.
Yeah, it's like one vocal run, probably, maybe 10 words. And there's 120 cuts in the actual vocal track. Nice. 120.
Yeah.
And it's like, to make it this perfect, we took this from this take, this from that take, this from that. And it's like, is this even really you singing anymore?
Right.
Or is it, AI version of Billie singing?
Right.
Currently.
Well, this sort of production starts with the Beatles, really. They went on and on, and it was the production team behind them who was making all the cuts. And they put part of this cut together from A Day in the Life, a part of that cut, and part of this. And George Martin was a great producer. I have no problems with his production. What he did was brilliant. However, the lessons learned from that were not. And the lessons learned was, the more we can edit, the more money we will make. And that's
and when did they ever tour again? When did they ever perform those songs live?
They never had to perform that stuff live.
Yeah.
So it's like YouTube singers now. They will film themselves over and over and over until they get the track they want, which is a skill in itself. But nevertheless, now let's put you in front of an audience.
Yeah, and that's where the music that's where the music is supposed to be. That's the other thing that is frustrating. And I have to say too, you know, I like a lot of digitally produced music. I've
Sure.
done digital production, sampling,
Yeah.
you know, hip hop. I'm still a fan of that stuff. But even someone in hip hop, you can go and see live and they're crushing their vocals,
Mhm.
you know, over this constructed digital beat. Or
Right.
even I've even seen hip hop shows where they have a drummer. That is sick. That's
Mm-hmm.
awesome when they can do something like that. But Christian music with the synths, like you mentioned Hillsong earlier,
Oh yeah.
this is not something that is designed for the worship space that I think is appropriate. The other thing that this kind of comes into question is the space in which the music is being performed.
Exactly.
Because I see, and they're so popular, especially in a place like Chicago, these big city churches, huge screens, a band on stage. Where's the altar? Huh? What's
Mhm.
going on with Eucharist? What's going on with the sermon? Who's preaching, doing the readings? It's so strange to see
Well,
that and to call it worship.
it's entertainment.
Yeah,
And
it's
this
uncomfortable to me.
is my underlining issue that starts going back to Dwight Moody, goes through the early 20th century in different forms. And there are some great songs in the early 20th century. By the way, this is giving me another 10-minute
Oh boy,
thing. Well,
I'll
we'll
keep
just,
it.
if you've got time, we'll do another one in 10 minutes.
Okay,
Okay.
sounds good.
So unfortunately, I've got to work this out, and they want me to spend way too much money on this. So anyway,
I was gonna say, if you've ever used the Facebook Hangouts, they don't cut you off because that's how we film my podcast.
oh, okay, that's really good to, yeah. Let me
So,
examine that.
of course.
Yeah, but but now you see we've entered a really weird world, and that weird world involves the little screen. It involves social media. It involves atomizing even the experience. So, how do you prevent people from using the little screen in a church? See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
QR codes is bane of my existence. The idea that you have to go to get onto a bus in a major city, you have to have a code on your phone, or you have to own a smart device that is able to read a cone on a sign, to go into a restaurant, to look at a menu, to get a bulletin for a church service, to see the announcements.
Right.
So dystopian, so disturbing.
Right.
And also, the other thing that I absolutely hate about it is the fact that it's super discriminating to a giant portion of the public.
Yeah.
You know,
well, I've tried not to have, I have a dumb phone. I've tried not to have a smartphone for a long time, but finally my bank said, hey, I said, my card is not working in Europe.
Yeah.
And I said, do you have plans to finally get the tap feature on it? And they said, no, just use our digital wallet. And we're like, okay, checkmate, you got me. And so, but fortunately, I was recently at this Bridges of Meaning festival, and someone there, a guy named Peter, thank you, Peter, gave me this thing called the pre-phone, which means essentially private phone. And it's something that he had been working on. He actually heard me saying that and walked up to me and said, here's a phone for you. And we just invented this. So I said, okay. So I went from the aughts to 2022, just like that. And I'm still figuring out what I want to know on the phone. I don't want too much. I don't want notifications for everything. I want to be as private as possible. I want, there are certain things like, we have this thing Bolt, which gets you a taxi here. Yeah, I'll take that. I'll take what I have to get to do certain things. But, I'm not going to be spending a lot of time watching movies on this thing. Because what is the point of watching movies in your hand? Are you watching movies? No.
Yeah.
You're watching weird digital imagery in your palm. That's what you're doing.
Yeah. And even speaking of which, going into the screen phenomenon, it's so interesting. I grew up attending the same church that my grandparents helped found in the town where I grew up. So huge history with my family and this church. And when I was in probably middle school or younger, there was a vote that took place in the church to decide, are we going to have screens? Because that was the new thing. You know,
Right.
this was, you know, in the aughts. And the vote was cast and they decided we're going to go with a screen. And so I think I went with my dad to go check out a couple different model screens, or perhaps the speakers that would be near the screen. And it was such an interesting moment in time, because now I look back on it and it's like the generations of my family that attended this church before my time didn't have this key element that is now like the focus of everyone's attention, apart from the sermon and communion, you know, when we're looking up at the front at the altar. And it's very strange. And I don't, you know, it's goofy because the people who are sort of revolting against the screen are all the young people. We're all the people who are pulling out the hymnals and turning to the page so we can read the music rather than look at the words and guess what the notes are. You know, but that's a
That's very
phenomenon across
interesting.
churches.
And I think actually it's your generation that is starting to realize, you know, a lot of this stuff we've been handed as being so like cool isn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, there's something missing in it. And I look at a very brief history of this whole thing with music and screens and stuff like, and hymnals. If you were to show up in the late 18th century, you would have heard music that sounds an awful lot like, and I'm going to get into this in my gospel discussion, an awful lot, and this is from the white people, an awful lot like black gospel music. Why? It would have been someone singing a line and then everyone repeating it.
Yeah.
And then they still use the phrase Dr. Watts to describe that style within black churches, which is ironic because Dr. Isaac Watts was the person who tried to get everyone to read from hymnals. And that was the next development. Somehow they missed the message here, you know.
That's kind of like Lutheranism.
Yeah. So then they went to the hymnals.
Yeah.
So then the hymnals lasted for a while. But now I remember when I was first a Christian, I became a Christian through the Jesus People, and I have an awful lot of thoughts about the music from that era. But what we were doing was, well, before I mention what we were doing, what I went into a church because we didn't have to go to any specific church on Sunday. So they just said, go to wherever. And I went to an evangelical free church. And I might as well have just been going into a mausoleum. And everyone, they did have like a new book of new little hymns, and they had a hymn book, but just the way people sang, it just sounded like we're all dead. And we've got to do this again, you know. So
that's
interesting. We, however, had a very different relationship to music. We wrote our own songs.
Yeah.
We adapted songs from different sources. We did not do any commercial music whatsoever. We actually kind of totally stripped the whole thing down. And what started happening was the music from Southern California started coming in by way of record. And then Maranatha music created the first praise songs. And they were based on things like Michael Rowe, The Boat Ashore, and Kumbaya, that were kind of folky gospel staples from the early 60s. But it was these short, repetitious phrases going over and over. And the reason that became popular was because you could learn these and we could all sing them, and you didn't have to look at any books because they were simple. But then more of these praise songs kept going, and people just wouldn't stop creating these things. And eventually it became a whole industry. And I remember the last hymn book we got at the Presbyterian Church in Alaska that I attended. The book is like this thick, and the last like 100 pages of the book is all copyright claims. And that says everything about the way that the music went. And it wasn't just copywriting songs. To copyright the old songs, they would copyright the actual song. What's the word I want to use? When one song feeds into another, it like I want to say like song programming or something like that, but they would copyright those as well because they had special music linking the songs together and stuff. And
like the layout of the actual service, the way the songs are linked together.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's really weird. Why would you be copywriting that?
Yeah.
But because you can make money off of that when you sell the hymnal. So, but then we had also shifted to the screen. And after a while, we had a minister who, besides just putting, okay, so Christ is no longer the center. The screen is.
Yeah.
And then to make it even more interesting, he starts putting, he was able to go out and film like the nature in Alaska. So he starts putting like running water behind the songs. And I'm sitting there going, if you're looking at a screen, you're involved with entertainment most likely. And yeah, but I sat there. I also had a rule, and people after a while, some people noticed me doing this, is I would never sing a song I didn't like. And I could always tell by picking up the hymnal ahead of time and looking at it and going like, oh, this is not going to be a good song. So I would just sit there silently and just read my Bible. One thing is the hymnals. The hymnals have really become messy and ugly. And I mean, like these different kinds of songs, they're mixing up all these songs they don't have. And I said, okay, I have these very strict, what I was doing was not singing the songs. Yeah. So I have these very strict things. I just feel like, okay, I don't have to sing this. It's not like, and it's just like, well, Byrne, don't you want to feel part of everything? Yes, I do, which is why I'm there. And I do sing the songs I really love or like, or find, okay, this could be interesting. Let's try this. Sometimes I'll start singing a song and I will be, what is this doing? Oh, I see. Okay, I better stop this now because it's just going to get mushy, and or it's going to get something. And all the Hillsong songs immediately. Some guy was trying to bring them in, and we didn't even have the big light show to go with it. So it just silly.
No laser beams at church.
Yes, but I realized that we need a new hymnal, and we need a hymnal that has the real meat and substance from many, many different American and British traditions. That is, say, it's an English book. So, but also the obvious standards that have been adapted from other cultures and such like that. So we need those. We need the classics. We need a sprinkling of the newer stuff that really works as hymns, because if you get too much of that stuff, you're now just doing what the book is. But then we need to dive into shape note singing, lining out, black gospel music, various traditions that, and not just songs to make you feel good, but songs that have some real depth. For instance, there's a Christmas song that almost no one sings called Star in the East. And this thing is like, goes off the edge as far as depth goes. I mean, it's just like dearer to God are the prayers of the poor. And it's just, brightest and best are the sons of the morning and stuff. It's just like, what language, what beauty. And anybody can get it. And you can find some, if you look up Star in the East on YouTube, you'll find some amazing versions of this. One done by a couple of girls who are just doing it in a contemporary way with acoustic guitars. Another one done as shape note singing, which is like, incredible stuff. And to me, it's and one of the interesting things about the revival of the Sacred Harp or shape note singing is that you can't sing this stuff without feeling real emotion because it's so deep. And there's a reason why people who aren't even Christians will go to these shape note conventions and stuff and sing for several days in a row and feel just, they'll walk out going like, I don't know if there's a God, but this music.
Yeah. The same thing's true of the people who go to, gospel music festivals and stuff, because it connects you in some way. I'm sure you're familiar with Robert Shaw Chorale.
Oh, the Robert Shaw Chorale. Oh, yeah.
He has an Easter record, which I have.
Right.
Just a collection of Easter hymns. So good, so interesting. And every year at the church I grew up at, at the Tenebrae service on Good Friday, the choir would sing this song, "'Tis Finished."
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of those songs that you only hear once a year. It's reminiscent, because you brought up that song, "Star in the East." That's what made me think about it. You know, this special holiday sort of, feast day sort of song. And what I loved about that so much is at the Tenebrae service, we have this, I'm sure it's very similar across churches, but the moment where the Christ candle leaves the actual sanctuary. And when the Christ candle leaves, they sing "'Tis finished, 'tis finished, so the Savior cried, then deeply bowed his head and died." And it has these haunting chords that just come out of nowhere. The beginning is very quiet. It starts almost with a whisper. And then the choir is, at full amperage, just belting out, "'Tis finished, yes, the deed is done. The battle's fought, the victory's won."
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of that song, we would always do that song once the candle had left and it's completely dark and you're just in the church. And
Mm-hmm.
we have great acoustics in that
Right.
church. Awesome. And then someone would take, whatever the largest book was, which is probably the organ music hymnal that's
Mhm.
up in the balcony, and just drop it on the
Yeah.
floor, and kind of has this sort of stone reverberance that happens throughout the whole church. And that always impacted me. And it was my favorite service because of how seriously everything was taken, and how, it had the emotional impact, but it wasn't self-serving in any way. It was completely focused on this day of Good Friday. And then, we have this amazing Easter celebration 3 days later. But what was interesting about that is I had a friend who always went to contemporary megachurch style rock concert worship, who one year came to Tenebrae service with us, and we left, and she said it felt like a cult. Whoa, what a crazy impact for a person in another world to experience that.
Well, here's what's interesting. And you were
Yeah.
saying, I'm sure, you've experienced this in a lot of churches. Actually not. You have to remember that in terms of Lutheran services, between
Sure.
the extremely liturgical down at one end, and we'll put the
Yeah.
Orthodox down here, and as well as the Orthodox, eventually the Catholics have kind of modernized over time, so they're not
Yeah.
quite as far down. But the Lutherans are about midway point. They're much closer to
Sure.
being like the Catholics than they are
Yeah.
to what's going on further on the other end, which is
Yeah.
you start getting into the independent church. You get the Baptists, then the independent churches, then eventually the wild and woolly fringes of Pentecostalism and such like that on
Yeah.
the other side. And as someone as part of the Jesus movement, we weren't even on the chart, and it didn't last that long. What we were doing didn't
Yeah.
last that long because it got taken over in a sense by some cultish aspects of the charismatic movement, and also
Sure.
the commercial aspects of the Christian contemporary scene. So, but no, that sounds great. But I can understand where there are people down here who would, even in Christian worship, who would look at that and go like, wow, that's really, some of them might love it.
Yeah.
And others of them would look at that as very strange. The way
Yeah.
someone who isn't a Christian might look at that and go like, what are you doing? Because they have no liturgy. They do.
Yeah.
They have weird liturgies in their life, but those
Mhm.
are secular liturgies or personal
Yeah.
religious liturgy.
And the thing is too, sometimes one thing that I find frustrating in a way, but I do understand it, is sometimes you go into a service that's very traditional, and not everything is explained. One of my family members goes to, I would almost say, borderline Catholic church, but it's Lutheran. Just
Wow.
because they do full on processional. Everyone is bowing before entering a pew, bowing, much more often than in the services I attended, just through going to different churches and whatnot. And they do incense and all this stuff, but not everything is explained. And it's it's like I leave the service having questions. So perhaps my friend in that moment who attended Tenebrae with me thought, what the heck is going on with all these different things that are occurring throughout the service? You know, what is the significance of this light being lit or blown out or leaving, or, you know, whatever else is going on? But there has to be some sort of connection. And I think something like music can make that, can bridge those worlds, I guess, in a way.
Right.
Because even if you're coming from that contemporary world, you can hear that music and it can still impact you in the same way maybe Hillsong impacts you.
Well, here's the interesting thing. Here in Georgia, among the Orthodox,
Yeah.
I haven't heard congregational singing.
Wow.
And it's done by choirs.
Yeah.
Part of it is, and they're not big choirs either, maybe 4 or 5 people.
Okay.
And it's absolutely spectacularly beautiful. And I think that one time I walked into a service and there was, I heard, there were these pillars. I was standing there like on either side, and there was a bunch of people. And I looked over here and I saw these men who were singing. And they were singing, and sometimes it's groups of women too. There's no specific rule about that. But a group of men singing in 4 or 5 part harmony, something really complex.
Yeah.
They have, and Georgian polyphony is absolutely deep, as I mentioned before. It's just, and in the church services, and they'll hit these unusual, like I say, dissonances and resolutions, which really baffled people coming from further west when they first realized what was going on here. And I was listening to this and just going like, oh my goodness, it's just so beautiful. You can feel God's presence in it.
Yeah.
And then it was finished. And then to my absolute, it was just like the sky just opened up. I didn't notice that behind this column over here was another group of 5 people who broke into the same tune. It was like, I want to say not an octave above, but it wasn't, it was almost like a third above or something like that. It was just like, all of a sudden, it's just like, and then the other group did it again. And they went back and forth. And I was just like, oh my goodness, how complex, how beautiful. And I think in the Orthodox tradition, the point is you give God your best.
Yeah.
Whereas in our traditions, increasingly it's been, we include everybody.
Yeah.
And the include everybody can mean someone can stand up and sing who has, well, to be kind, little skill. and then we'll all be like, oh, that was so good. And the Georgians have a way of doing that too. It's not in church. You know, they do it at these ritual meals where they'll sing together and stuff. And then you throw the little 3-year-old girl in there and we listen to her sing. And if she's got a good voice, we encourage that because the Georgians are always looking for a good voice. Someone once said, you know, maybe history would have been different if Joseph Stalin, who evidently had a beautiful voice because he was Georgian, was able to pursue music. And I just said, no, you don't understand. You pick up a rock and throw it here and you're going to find someone who has a great voice. Because the Georgians really love to sing, and they still do traditional singing at these meals called supras. So it's a different world here. But, you know, that does make me, the eternal Protestant, say, well, what about us? You know, now the point is we can't do that. Maybe the Georgians do. And I have groups of friends here who do sing, although many of them professionally. But like I said, you know, one of my Georgian friends was listening to the mosque chant and immediately harmonizing with it. You know, immediately you go like, ah.
Yeah. And
he was going like, you know, he was finding the harmonics and not the simple ones either, you know. But one of the reasons I'm here is because I wanted to learn how this culture still has folk traditions where ours has lost most of ours. I think you can still find them in the Black churches. I think you can still find them in weird things like cheerleading. It's a weird tradition.
Yeah, pageantry.
Army, Marine drill call chants and stuff. You can still hear but basically we don't sing together anymore. And when people sing on YouTube and stuff, they're performing. They're not singing. And to me, there's a difference between a performance and actually singing together. And I'll give you a chance to jump in a second.
Go ahead.
And the thing that the Georgians don't have that we do have is they have no self-consciousness when they sing. They don't imagine themselves singing. So at a supra, they just sing.
Yeah.
They go for everything. They're not holding back. Now, I think the presence of cameras and such will eventually erode that to a degree. But my feeling is as long as Georgians have supras in churches services, they're going to keep their music alive. Whereas America has lost much of ours, because even in churches, we imagine, I look kind of dorky doing this. Self-consciousness about, I noticed that creeping in the 1970s, because we didn't have it in our Christian Jesus people days. We had no self-consciousness because we were not performing. We were just singing. But I did notice later in the decade, I worked at Glacier National Park in Montana, and there were people who were having a campfire, and then they were singing songs. And what were they singing? They were singing John Denver, the Beatles and stuff. And I'm sitting there going like, okay, that's better than nothing. But that's all pop music, and when they sing it, they know that very well. They're not singing it as if they really believed Eleanor Rigby had a problem. They're not singing it as though, they've ever been to West Virginia.
Yeah.
It's just, they're copying the music they've heard on the radio, which is a radically different proposition. But eventually even that would be seen as kind of like just some sort of like cliche. It's just like singing around the campfire, singing John Denver songs. By the mid-1980s, that was pretty much gone. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Okay, now you can jump in. I'm sure you've got tons to say.
You went to so many things. I have so many different things I thought of. But interesting about the where is the American, the Great American Songbook, haha, to play on words. But it's like we have the national anthem and Amazing Grace, I guess, and then popular music. And that's about it. But the one thing that I really appreciate about the Lutheran tradition, it's very singing, congregation focused. I grew up in a church where even if you don't like the hymn, everyone around you is singing it, or at least attempting to, including, my grandmother when she was alive, who had lost her voice due to health problems earlier in her life. And that's something that's still alive in a lot of churches, Lutheran churches, that I really appreciate. And what I have found is the more a church opens up to having a praise band or having, song leaders, the less the congregation sing. And it's because of that connection that you just made. We're thinking about what other people think about our singing. I have friends who are self-conscious to sing in front of me, their friend, when I just proposed the idea of maybe we should work on this song, because I'm kind of like a mini song leader in my group of friends for, coming up with stuff. And I help out a lot with like our youth group and sort of just activities at the church. And what I would love to have is to have the kids who are coming up in the next generation know at least a couple basic songs. At my school, throughout my schooling, everybody at least knew the doxology and the harmonies for it. So if somebody sings, okay, we're going to close this meal, or we're going to open up this activity with the doxology, we'd all know that part. And it was inherent because we grew up with it. I strive and I wish that could be across American culture, but I know there's so many different sects that I don't know if it will ever fully come back without being something, commercialized, like you say.
Well, you'll be happy to know that I've been working for years I want to do a series of half-hour videos or so It's called The 100 Songs Every American Should Know. And
I'll be sharing this video everywhere.
Yeah, well, no, it'll be a series of, because I don't want to put them all on one.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll play multiple versions, but obviously Amazing Grace is one and Star Spangled Banner is one. But do I even have the Star Spangled Banner? It might be too obvious. But because I think it's one of the few songs that we've traditionally sung that we all know. But and basically I have a rule that once the music starts sounding like international music, like a style, for instance, there won't be any punk rock on it, much as I kind of like punk rock. There won't be any hippie music or classic rock, because most of that has a sound that you can find everywhere. There won't be any hip hop, there won't be any anything. So there's kind of a mid 60s cutoff, but at the same time, it won't be like folky music either. So I'll be diving into everything from all the roots of American traditional music.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, I'm really more interested in, these are the songs you should know. I mean, someone should just say Camptown Races and you should just go doo-dah. Someone should say, Swing Low and you should say Sweet Chariot. You should know these that well.
Yeah.
And because this is part of your heritage as an American. It doesn't matter what your ethnic background is. It matters that you have some sense of where we've come from. And these songs, so that and one could add, basically the whole thing is kind of a back and forth between black and white styles. And what has been added from other cultures, like there is a lot of Italian American stuff, there is some Germanic stuff, there is some Swedish stuff, is there any Finnish? Oh, Be Still My Soul, is that one?
Well, yeah, I was gonna say Finlandia.
Yeah, exactly. But that's more, again, that's kind of European. So but it's entering into that dialogue, because what's happened is, even in, say, there's lots of Italian American music, one could think of Frank Sinatra, but what's he really singing? He's singing something that's a mixture between his Italian roots and the whole American post-minstrel pop music roots, including jazz, including all of this goes into creating a sound that was unique and American. So there are songs, it's just like looking for the music that, because I noticed that younger generations have been more cut off from these. Whereas when I was young, everyone knew this stuff. That is to say, it was just part of the culture. So you'd hear something in a cartoon, or you would hear it referenced. Now what we tend to hear referenced are things from the 1980s, sometimes earlier, but it's like culture now for everyone starts in the 1980s, which is when you get everything being, it's like you've for the most part, removed everything that was part of the traditional American culture, this black and white back and forth. Occasionally you'll find it show up in songs by Beyonce, or you'll find it in various artists, but you rarely hear the twang of country music, even in a lot of country music. And not a lot of it tends to be kind of a country rock thing, although I think the better performers know their roots. It's the same, like the better performers of gospel music know their roots.
Yeah.
So
it's not all prosperity gospel, which is a phenomenon.
We're not going to go there.
No.
So, well, I've appreciated talking to you a lot, and we should do it again, obviously. And I think that there's so much more to say. I'm going to send you links for a couple of I'm going to send you one link of my friend John Graham here talking about what Georgian music is. And I think you'll find that fascinating, because he's also he sings in a church choir and hits one of the harmony notes. And then I'll also send you a link to the infamous minstrel video, which I don't publicize this much, just because I know if this went to the wrong places, people go like, what is he talking about? Because it doesn't do what people want it to do. But again, I think the people who are most misunderstand it are not going to be Black. The people who most misunderstand are the people who went through university in the last 20 years.
Someone who can be offended for you on your behalf.
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, there are a lot of issues related to Christian music. I'm glad we've had this chance to discuss it, though, because I don't often talk about it.
Yeah, this is something I talk about kind of nonstop
Yeah,
with my
obviously.
friends. So it's great to hear your perspective, and also just to have somebody out there voicing this stuff publicly online,
Yeah.
So
Well, it does give us a place to refer to what about Christian music? Well, listen to this dialogue. It might be interesting to you.
Yeah.
So that's good. And eventually, I did a lecture called From the Monastery to the Marketplace, which was all about kind of a history of kind of congregational singing. And then I did, I will be doing the 2 on gospel music, but I've got to get this series called The Cute and the Creepy out of my system first, which is going to.
I do have to say, I watched the first episode of that. Very interesting stuff.
Yeah.
I actually listened to it technically on my my drive.
Yeah.
And man, that story of the woman with no hands. I was completely unfamiliar with it. I knew kind of some of the earlier ones you talked about, in the beginning portion of the video, but what a twist. I've got to go look it up and read it now. What a unique story that I was completely unfamiliar with.
Yeah, you can find it online. You can find it, obviously, I think one should buy an unedited Grimm's as original. But like I say, even in their lifetime, they made several different versions. So of their collections. But I got to get this out of my system, because this is another thing I think Christians don't understand at all, because the images, particularly of the cute, have invaded the church as well. And you can see this when you think about Vacation Bible School stuff and whatnot. And
that could be a whole talk.
Yeah,
Vacation
because what it is,
School,
and I would look at these things, or even something like Veggie Tales. I mean, we're getting off, and this could trigger you here.
Yeah. This is like my childhood.
I remember once I was at L'Abri, and what was it? But I think it was 2005. And at L'Abri, they have these, meals they all would eat. But someone somewhere said, we're going to have a dinner where we listen to Veggie Tales music. And I was like, oh Lord. And what was strange was half of them were listening to it with like genuine nostalgia, and the other half were listening to it with the most blood-curdling irony. And I thought, this is very interesting. And then I said, and how do you take gospel stories seriously if they're told to you by talking vegetables? Funny talking vegetables. And this made me start, I'd been thinking about cute things before this, but this started to crystallize a few things for me. And that they had these, I would see the posters for the Vacation Bible School, and there's this whole industry of the Vacation Bible School, and I'm going, what are these people doing? Who are these?
It's like the music for children. That's a whole other topic, but music specifically marketed for kids. It's like, what is this world we live in?
They are, you could say that music marketed for children is like Baskin Robbins. And that's about the nutritional level they're getting musically and culture. They're just getting the 31 flavors. They're just getting sugar and milk and some sprinkles. They're not getting, and that's what I also was trying to point out. I don't know how successfully. I didn't really get into what I probably will during the real Cute and Creepy series. That's just like one of the addendums that'll be at the end. Is that children have changed as a result of child-specific culture being pushed upon them, not from their parents, although their parents collude, but from these huge organizations who think this is how we communicate whatever we're communicating to children.
Yeah.
And that goes beyond creepy. That goes to eerie to me. It's just like, do you have any idea what you're doing to the children? And this is what this this meal, dinner, breakfast for dinner. And I was just like, yeah, what other culture does this? It's like,
I could just
and the
picture it. I see
Europeans there were
exactly.
just completely, the Europeans who were at L'Abri and saw the Americans doing this were like, breakfast for dinner? Doing, so you get pancakes and waffles and cereal for dinner, and you listen to this. What are you, the levels of irony there. And the Europeans at L'Abri who were visiting at that time were like, we don't understand this at all.
Yeah.
Because American is such an ironic culture.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm doing is looking for ways to keep the humor, but let's dig back into the real emotion, honest emotion.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you have any last thoughts, comments, criticisms, concerns, questions?
I had so many places I could go with all the different comments that were shared. But I'll just end it here because it's probably a good idea for me to hit the hay pretty soon here. Lovely talking with you.
Oh, that's right.
So good to meet you.
Yeah.
The conversation can continue, especially with that diving into Vacation Bible School, or if you've ever heard of Children's Church. Interesting.
Fortunately,
concept.
that's been off my radar.
Yeah. So it's basically an idea where, mid-service, all the children can leave and go to their own special church service.
Yeah. They did that at our church. Yeah.
Yeah. Just thoughts on who's participating in the service and how should we participate? That's something I could definitely, dive more into and speak on. But yeah, anyway, I'll end it there though. Really love talking with you though. Great.
Okay, Laura. Well, we will do this again and in the not too distant future. And I'll send you an email and we can discuss some other stuff. So,
perfect.
Well, thanks for being on the Anadromist. And we'll talk some more.
All right. Sounds like a plan.
And
enjoy your day.
I'll let you know when this is going to air.
Cool.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Well, that was a very interesting conversation, wasn't it? I thought it was. I really enjoyed talking about these strange ins and outs of Christian music. And I do think there is hope for Christian music to become as solid as it once was. But it's going to take some work on people besides myself because, I'm getting older and I won't have time. But some of you who are younger can really wrestle with these issues and do something. And don't just think about doing something, do something. Well, let's see. What else can we talk about? Oh, we could talk about how you could support the channel. There is a link down below and you can subscribe. Well, you can subscribe as well and share and comment. That would be nice. Do you have any thoughts about Christian music? Or you can use the link down below and help keep me afloat since I make absolutely nothing on these videos through YouTube. Well, Anadromous Dialogues. Anadromous means swimming against the stream. And I hope that's what we've been doing, and not, as G.K. Chesterton says, being a dead thing floating down the river with the stream. And these days, the stream is pretty much all propaganda. So I'm trying to be different than that, and hopefully in our discussions we have at least swum an inch or two back up the stream. Well, from Tbilisi, Georgia, this is Byrne saying Droavit, which in Georgian means literally, well, it kind of means, see you later, but literally what it means is temporarily. We'll just be out of sight temporarily, and then we'll meet up again. And we will.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.